You've entered void of rules, a realm where normal constraints cease to exist. But beware, traveller, there is one rule here. You've got to hit subscribe. Seriously, it's the only rule we have. We just reached 1,000 brave souls, and we're hunting for 9,000 more to complete our dark ritual. I mean, reach our next goal, so subscribe. Or don't. But remember, the void remembers those who defy the only rule. Now let's get into today's video. John Matthews had always been good at fixing things. Computers mostly. Sometimes people's problems. If the price was right and the questions stayed unasked. At 34, he'd carved out a living in the shadowy spaces between legitimate IT consulting and the kind of work that paid in cryptocurrency and left no paper trail. His Portland office sat above a Chinese restaurant, the smell of sesame oil and soy sauce permanently embedded in the carpet. It was past midnight when the secure phone buzzed, the one he kept in his desk drawer, wrapped in a towel like some shameful secret. The message was different this time. No job details, no payment amount, just coordinates and a time. St. Mary's Cathedral, 11:47 p.m, confessional 3. John stared at the screen, his coffee growing cold in the styrofoam cup. In 3 years of taking these mysterious jobs, he'd never been asked to meet anywhere. Everything was always digital, anonymous, clean, but his rent was 2 months behind, and his credit cards were maxed out from medical bills after his father's funeral last spring. The old man had died slowly, expensively, and alone except for John's weekend visits to the hospice. The cathedral loomed against the October sky like a Gothic accusation. John's footsteps echoed in the empty nave as he made his way to the confessionals, each sound seeming to bounce off the vaulted ceiling forever. The wooden booth smelled of old incense and older secrets. He knelt, his knees cracking on the worn manila that had supported countless sinners before him. "You may speak freely, Mr. Matthews." The voice came from behind the partition, heavily accented, definitely Italian, with the kind of authority that came from centuries of practice. Each word was carefully measured, precisely enunciated. "We have been watching your work. Your particular skills have caught our attention." "I fix computers," John said carefully, his mouth suddenly dry. The lie came automatically, though he suspected it fooled no one. A soft chuckle that seemed to come from everywhere at once, resonating in the confined space. Among other things, the man in Seattle who was embezzling from children's charities, found floating in Elliott Bay with his laptop's hard drive mysteriously corrupted. The woman in Vancouver who was selling information to human traffickers, discovered in her apartment, apparent suicide, all her client records permanently deleted. The corrupt judge in Sacramento, who was taking bribes to reduce sentences for rapists, heart attack in his chambers, his entire digital footprint wiped clean. The voice paused, letting the implications sink in. "You have a remarkable talent for making problems disappear permanently and cleanly." John's hands started shaking. Those jobs had been anonymous, untraceable, or so he'd thought. Each one had paid enough to keep him afloat for months, and each target had deserved exactly what they got. But someone had been watching. Someone had been keeping a very detailed score. "We represent certain interests within Vatican City," the voice continued, each word dropping like a stone into still water. "Ancient interests. Interests that predate most modern nations. We have need of your services for a matter of utmost delicacy and extraordinary compensation." A thick manila envelope slid through the petition's small window with a whisper of paper against wood. John's hands trembled as he opened it, the sound of the paper unnaturally loud in the enclosed space. 5 photographs, 5 names, 5 addresses written in different handwriting styles, and at the bottom, written in elegant script that looked like it belonged in a medieval manuscript. 500,000 per name. 1 million bonus upon completion. payment in untraceable gold bullion. The first photograph showed a distinguished man in a three-piece suit, his eyes cold and calculating behind wire-rimmed spectacles. Frank Bellamy, born 1878, died 1923. The newspaper clipping attached showed his obituary. Prominent politician killed in automobile accident on October 15th, 1923. But, written in red ink, across the clipping were the words, "Still receiving mail at 1247 Hawthorne Boulevard." Richard Gray stared back from the second photo, cigarette dangling from his lips, his expression predatory and knowing. Born 1910, disappeared 1954. The attached notes mentioned a corruption scandal involving stolen war bonds, his body never found after his car went off the Burnside Bridge. In the margin, someone had written, "Spotted at Eastside Industrial Complex, Building 7. Helen Carter's publicity shot was signed with a flourish, her beauty almost radiating off the black and white photograph. Born 1925, died 1947. Hollywood starlet, found dead in her dressing room after her final performance. Cause of death listed as heart failure. Across the bottom, in different handwriting, still performing at Neptune Theatre, nightly shows. Colonel Arthur Devereux wore a Union Army uniform in his formal portrait, medals gleaming on his chest. Born 1831, killed at Gettysburg 1863, leading a charge against Confederate positions. The note attached was brief. Laurelhurst Park every evening at dusk. The final photograph made John's blood freeze. A medieval painting of a papal figure in ornate robes, his face serene but somehow terrible. Pope Gregory XVII, elected 1519, vanished 1521. Never found, presumed dead, but his body never recovered from the Vatican's secret archives. No address was given, only, "He will find you when the others are complete." "I don't understand," John whispered to the partition, his voice cracking like a teenager's. "These people are all dead. Have been for decades, some for centuries." "Are they?" the voice asked, and John could hear the smile in it, cold and knowing. "Check the addresses, Mr. Matthews. You'll find they're quite current, quite occupied. These individuals have certain debts to pay, certain contracts to fulfill. They've been avoiding their obligations for far too long." "But how is that possible? How can someone from 1923 still be—" "Death," the voice interrupted smoothly, "is not always the end of one's usefulness. The Vatican has learned, over many centuries, that certain souls resist their proper departure. They cling to the mortal realm, avoiding judgment, avoiding payment for their earthly sins. We merely collect what is owed." When John looked up, heart hammering against his ribs, the confessional was empty. Only the envelope remained, heavy with cash and impossible promises that smelled faintly of grave dirt and old parchment. John drove through the empty Portland streets, his mind racing like a hamster on a wheel. The cash in the envelope was real. He'd counted it twice. More money than he'd ever seen at once. But the job made no sense. How do you kill people who died before your grandparents were born? And why would anyone pay millions for such an impossible task? The first address led to a Victorian mansion in the Pearl District, its Gothic Revival architecture stark against the modern condos surrounding it. John had driven past it countless times without really seeing it, the way you ignore familiar landmarks. Now, standing before its ornate facade at 2 a.m, he noticed things that shouldn't be there. Fresh newspapers on the porch, folded neatly and dated today. A warm, inviting glow from the windows. Electric lights that somehow cast the warm yellow of gas lamps. The faint sound of a radio playing music that belonged to another century entirely. A waltz that seemed to drift from the house like perfume. As he approached the front steps, every instinct John had developed over 3 years of dangerous work, screamed at him to run. The house felt wrong, like looking at a photograph that had somehow stepped out of its frame and begun moving. The front door, solid oak with brass fittings that gleamed like new, opened at his touch without a sound, revealing a parlour frozen in time. Everything was perfectly preserved. The horsehair sofa, with its intricate embroidery, the gramophone in the corner playing a scratchy waltz, the crystal decanters on the mahogany bar cart filled with amber liquid that caught the lamplight like liquid gold. Only there was no dust, no decay, no sense of age despite the antique furnishings. The room felt lived in, warm, occupied by someone who had just stepped out and might return at any moment. Frank Bellamy sat in a leather wingback chair by the fireplace reading the evening edition of a newspaper. As John entered, Bellamy looked up with mild interest, folding the paper with deliberate care. The date at the top read October 15th, 1923, the day he had supposedly died. "Punctual," Bellamy said, his voice carrying a slight Boston accent that had been bred out of American speech decades ago. "I do appreciate punctuality in a man. It speaks to character, to breeding, to the kind of values this country seems to have forgotten." He gestured to a matching chair across from him. "Please, have a seat. We have much to discuss, you and I." John remained standing, his hand moving instinctively toward the Glock 19 beneath his jacket. His heart was pounding so hard, he was sure Bellamy could hear it echoing in the quiet room. "You're supposed to be dead." "Supposed to be, yes." Bellamy reached for a brandy snifter on the side table, the liquid swirling like liquid amber in the crystal. Death certificate filed, obituary published, grave dug and filled, all the proper paperwork completed. He took a sip, savouring it with the appreciation of a true connoisseur. "Funny thing about death, Mr. Matthews. Sometimes it doesn't take. Sometimes there are complications, shall we say." The house felt like it was breathing around them, the walls seeming to pulse with some hidden life. The grandfather clock in the corner ticked with metronomic precision. But when John glanced at its face, the hands were spinning wildly backward, decades unwinding in seconds. "Oh my God," John whispered, backing towards the door, as the impossible reality crashed over him like a cold wave. "This isn't possible. You died 100 years ago. I saw your obituary." "Died, yes, but not departed." Bellamy stood with the fluid grace of a much younger man, and John noticed that his feet didn't quite touch the Persian rug beneath them. He hovered, suspended by some force that had nothing to do with physics. "Do you know what it's like, Mr. Matthews, to be trapped between moments, to live the same day over and over, waiting for someone to finally finish what was started so long ago?" The temperature in the room dropped 20 degrees in seconds. John's breath misted in the suddenly frigid air as frost began forming on the windows. The fire in the fireplace burned cold and blue, casting shadows that moved independently of their sources. "I made certain deals in life," Bellamy continued, beginning to pace around John in a slow circle. "Certain contracts with certain parties. I thought I was clever, thought I could cheat the system, avoid payment when it came due. But the Vatican keeps excellent records, Mr. Matthews. They always collect their debts, even if it takes a century." John drew his weapon, the metal so cold it burned his palm. "I'm sorry," he said, and was surprised by the sincerity in his voice. Bellamy smiled, and his teeth were the colour of old ivory, some of them cracked and yellowed with age. "No, don't be sorry. This is what I've been waiting for. This is what we've all been waiting for." He raised his glass in a mock toast, the brandy now frozen solid in the crystal. "To completion, to the settling of old debts." John fired 6 shots centre mass, the gunshots deafeningly loud in the enclosed space, each muzzle flash illuminating the room in stark relief. The bullets passed through Bellamy's chest without leaving a mark, embedding themselves in the chair's leather with soft thuds that sounded like distant thunder. Bellamy didn't flinch. didn't spill his brandy, didn't even blink. Instead, he began to laugh, a sound like breaking glass mixed with winter wind. "Excellent form," he said conversationally, as if commenting on John's golf swing. "Perfect grouping. Your reputation is well deserved." He gestured to the smoking holes in the chair behind him, the leather already beginning to repair itself, though I'm afraid you'll find conventional methods somewhat inadequate for our particular situation. John's hands were shaking so violently he nearly dropped the gun. "What the hell are you—" "I'm exactly what you were hired to eliminate," Bellamy said, settling back into his chair as if nothing had happened. The bullet holes in the leather were gone now, the upholstery perfect once again. A debt unpaid, a contract unfulfilled, a soul that refuses to honour its obligations. The question is, Mr. Matthews, do you understand what that makes you? The room around them began to shift and blur, the walls stretching impossibly high, the ceiling disappearing into darkness. John could hear voices whispering in languages he didn't recognize, could smell something that might have been incense or might have been sulphur. When John looked back from the doorway, fleeing in terror as the house groaned and twisted behind him, the chair was empty. The newspaper lay folded on the seat, its headline perfectly legible in the lamplight. Local politician dies in motor accident. But underneath, in smaller print that definitely hadn't been there before, new words were writing themselves in red ink. John Matthews accepts Vatican contract. Collection initiated. John's hands were still shaking when he reached his car, fumbling with the keys as he tried to process what had just happened. The money was real, the address was real, but Frank Bellamy should have been dust and bones in some Portland cemetery. Instead, he'd been sitting in his parlour like he'd never left, reading a newspaper from the day he died, waiting for someone to finally complete whatever twisted contract had kept him anchored to the world. As John drove away, he glanced in his rearview mirror and saw that the Victorian mansion was dark again, abandoned, just another piece of architectural history forgotten by a city that valued progress over preservation. But he could still smell brandy and grave dirt, still hear that terrible laughter echoing in his ears. The second address took him to the industrial district, to a complex of brick buildings that had been abandoned since the 1970s when the last of Portland's manufacturing base fled to cheaper locations overseas. Except tonight, impossibly, the parking lot was full of pristine 1950s automobiles, chrome-heavy Buicks and Cadillacs that gleamed under streetlights that hummed with electricity. Light poured from windows that should have been broken decades ago, and John could hear the sound of machinery that hadn't run since his father was a child. The security gate stood open, though John was certain it had been chained and padlocked every other time he'd driven past. A sign that read, Grey Industrial Solutions, founded 1,945 inches hung beside the entrance, the paint fresh and bright despite the decades of weather it should have endured. John found Richard Grey in what had once been the executive offices, sitting behind a mahogany desk the size of a small car. He was exactly as he appeared in the photograph. Sharp pinstriped suit, slicked back hair held in place with pomade, cigarette between his fingers, trailing smoke that seemed to move against the air currents. A radio on the windowsill played big band music, the sound crackling with the warmth of a live performance from some long-dead studio. "The Vatican's boy," Grey said without looking up from his paperwork, his fountain pen scratching across documents that rustled like autumn leaves. "Right on schedule. They always were good with timing, those papal bastards. Punctual as Swiss clockwork and twice as cold." "How did you know I was coming?" John's voice came out as a croak, his throat still raw from the cold in Bellamy's house. Grey finally raised his eyes and they were the colour of cigarette ash, flat and lifeless as a dead television screen. "Because I've been waiting, son. We've all been waiting. For decades, for centuries. For someone like you to finally show up and finish the job we started so long ago." He gestured to the chair across from his desk with a manicured hand that bore a college ring from a university that had probably been demolished before John was born. "Sit. Let's have a conversation about eternity, about debt, about the kind of contracts that don't end just because your heart stops beating." John remained standing, every muscle tense, ready to run or fight, though he was beginning to suspect both options were equally useless. "I'm here to finish a job." "Are you?" Gray leaned back in his chair, the leather creaking, like old bones settling into familiar positions. He studied John like a specimen under glass, his gaze calculating and cold as a banker's. "Tell me, what exactly do you think you're doing here? What do you think this contract really means?" "I'm being paid to kill you." Gray's laugh was like grinding gears, mechanical and harsh, the sound of machinery that needed oil and maintenance. "Kill me, kill me." He shook his head, stubbing out his cigarette in an ashtray that was already overflowing with butts, some of them still smouldering, despite being decades old. "Son, I died in 1954. Car went off the Burnside Bridge on a foggy Tuesday night, November 16th, to be exact. Drunk, they said in the papers, though between you and me, I was stone sober when I hit that water." The office around them began to shift and blur, the walls seeming to breathe like living things. The radio's music warped and distorted, playing backward and forward simultaneously, big band arrangements mixing with sounds that might have been voices or might have been machinery. John could smell river water, cold and murky, filling his nostrils with the scent of death and decay. "Oh my God," John gasped, stumbling backward as his vision began to swim. "You're not real. None of this is real." "Real?" Gray stood, and John noticed that his expensive suit was soaking wet, river water dripping from his sleeves onto the pristine carpet, leaving stains that spread like blood. "Real is a relative concept when you're stuck between life and death, boy. Real is what happens when the Vatican decides you're more useful as a tool than as a corpse." The water kept coming, pouring from Gray's clothes, his hair, his mouth when he spoke. The office began to flood, black river water rising around John's ankles, thick with weeds and the taste of rust and despair. In the water, John could see things moving, pale shapes that might have been fish, or might have been fingers. "I made a deal," Gray continued, walking around the desk as water sloshed with each step. "Sold some information to some very bad people during the war. Nothing too terrible, I thought. Just some shipping schedules, some troop movements, the kind of thing that happens in wartime." His eyes had gone completely black now, reflecting nothing. But the Vatican keeps track of every soul, lost because of such deals. Every death can be traced back, every consequence calculated and recorded. John pulled his gun, this time not hesitating, not apologizing. He emptied the entire 15-round magazine into Gray's chest, each shot echoing like thunder in the flooded office. The bullets passed through him like he was made of smoke and river water, pocking the wall behind his chair in a tight grouping that would have made any instructor proud. Gray looked down at his unmarked shirt, water still pouring from the bullet holes that weren't there, then back at John with something that might have been pity. "Feel better? Got that out of your system?" He walked closer, his footsteps leaving wet prints on the carpet that was somehow both flooded and dry. "Now let me tell you what's really happening here." "Stay back." John fumbled for a spare magazine, his hands slick with sweat and river water that shouldn't exist. "I'm a man with unfinished business," Gray said, reaching out with one dripping hand. "Just like you'll be once this is over. Just like all of us are. The Vatican doesn't collect the living, Mr. Matthews. It collects the useful, the guilty, the damned." When Gray's wet fingers touched John's forehead, images flooded his mind like a burst dam. The car going over the bridge in slow motion, the desperate scramble to escape, as water rushed through broken windows, the terrible moment of understanding that this wasn't an accident, that someone wanted him dead. And then the cold, the crushing pressure, the desperate struggle for air that never came. Finally, floating in darkness, waiting for judgment that never arrived, waiting for someone to finally complete the contract that had been signed in his blood and sealed with his death. John fled, leaving Gray standing in his office, water pooling around his feet as the radio played songs from a decade that had ended before John was born. As he reached the exit, John heard Gray call after him, "See you soon, Mr. Matthews, sooner than you think." Outside, the industrial complex was dark and abandoned again, the parking lot empty except for weeds growing through cracked asphalt. But John's shoes were wet and he could still taste river water on his lips. The third address was the most disturbing yet. The old Neptune Theatre hadn't hosted a performance since 1963, its Art Deco facade crumbling under decades of Portland rain and neglect. But tonight every light blazed like opening night on Broadway. The marquee that should have been dark and broken, announcing in glowing letters, "Tonight only, Helen Carter in Midnight Review, final performance forever." The lobby was full of people in evening wear from different decades, some in 1940s suits and gowns, others in Victorian finery, still others in clothing that looked medieval. They chatted and laughed as they moved toward the theatre doors, their conversations a babble of different languages and different centuries. But as John pushed through the crowd, he realized none of them were casting shadows on the marble floor. None of them were quite touching the ground. And when he tried to meet their eyes, they looked right through him, as if he wasn't there, as if he was the ghost haunting their eternal party. John found Helen on stage, alone, despite the packed theatre, performing for an audience that applauded without sound. She wore a shimmering silver evening gown that caught the spotlights like captured starlight, her voice filling the space with a melancholy beauty that seemed to come from somewhere beyond the world. The song was hauntingly familiar, though John was certain he'd never heard it before. Something about lost love and second chances and the terrible price of staying when you should go. When she finished, taking her bow to silent applause that somehow thundered in the empty spaces between sounds, she looked directly at him, in the back row. Her eyes found his across the packed theatre with laser precision, and when she smiled, John saw that her perfect teeth were stained with blood. "I've been expecting you," she said, her voice somehow reaching him clearly despite the distance and the crowd. "Though I must say, you're younger than most of them send." Helen glided down the aisle with impossible grace, the audience parting before her like water, their forms flickering as she passed. Up close, she was breathtakingly beautiful, but there was something hollow about her eyes, like windows into empty rooms. Her skin had a porcelain quality that seemed to glow with its own inner light, and when she moved, John could hear the rustle of silk that sounded like whispered prayers. "Every night, the same performance," she said, settling into the seat beside him with a rustle of fabric. "Every night, the same death at the final curtain. Every night, I take my bow and die again." She turned to face him fully, and John saw that her throat bore a thin red line, barely visible, but definitely there, like a necklace made of dried blood. "Do you know how exhausting it is to die the same death over and over again?" "Oh my God," John whispered, staring at the mark on her throat that seemed to pulse with its own heartbeat. "How is this possible?" Possible. Helen's laugh was like silver bells, beautiful and terrible, the sound of something precious being broken repeatedly. "Nothing about this is possible, darling. But here we are anyway, trapped in our little theatre of the absurd." She reached out and touched his face with fingers that felt like cool marble, smooth and cold and somehow electric. "Tell me, do you know why you're really here?" Around them, the silent audience began to turn in their seats, all of them focusing on John with eyes that held no life, no warmth, only a hungry need that seemed to pull at his soul. Their faces were pale and drawn, their evening wear from different decades, different centuries. Some wore medieval robes, others Victorian finery, still others modern suits and dresses that looked normal, until you noticed they were all stained with something dark around the collar. "They're all collectors," Helen whispered, her breath cold against his ear, smelling of roses and embalming fluid. "Every person in this theatre was once like you. Desperate, talented, willing to do anything for money. The Vatican has been at this game for a very long time, darling. Longer than most countries have existed." John found his voice, though it came out strangled and weak. "I'm here to help you." "Are you?" Her smile was sad and knowing, the expression of someone who had seen too much and lived too long in the space between life and death. "Or are you here to join us? The Vatican has such interesting ways of collecting what it needs." The theatre around them began to shift, the walls stretching impossibly high, the ceiling disappearing into a darkness that seemed to go on forever. The audience grew larger, more faces turning toward John, more eyes reflecting light that came from no visible source. "I performed here the night I died," Helen continued, her voice taking on a dreamy quality. "October 31st, 1947. Halloween night, how perfectly theatrical. I was supposed to marry a producer the next week. Leave all this behind for a nice house in Beverly Hills and a normal life." She touched the mark on her throat again, and it began to bleed fresh blood that stained her silver gown. "But I'd made certain arrangements to get the role, certain promises to certain people, the kind of deals that come due when you least expect them." John raised his gun, but Helen shook her head gently. "Not necessary, darling," she said, standing and smoothing her gown with movements that were too fluid, too graceful for anything human. "Your being here is enough. The contract is fulfilled simply by your presence. You found us, you've seen us, and now you're part of us." She walked back to the stage, her heels clicking on the worn carpet in a rhythm that matched John's heartbeat. As she began to sing again, her form grew translucent, fading with each note until only her voice remained. Then even that dissolved into silence. The audience faded with her, leaving John alone in an empty, decaying theatre that smelled of mould and abandonment and something else, something that might have been roses or might have been death. But in his pocket, his phone buzzed. A new message, though he hadn't heard it ring. "Target acquired. Proceed to next address. The payment has been transferred to your account." John checked his banking app with trembling fingers. The money was there, $500,000, just as promised. But how could they pay him for killing someone who was already dead? And why did his hands feel cold, colder than they should, even in the abandoned theatre? The fourth address led to Laurelhurst Park, but not the park John knew. As he walked through the entrance at dusk, the modern playground and walking paths dissolved around him like a mirage, replaced by rolling hills and split-rail fences, by cannons and medical tents and the terrible organized chaos of a military encampment. The air filled with the sound of distant cannon fire, the shouting of men, the scream of horses in agony. The Battle of Gettysburg was being fought in a Portland park, and John was walking through the middle of it. Ghostly figures in blue and grey uniforms charged past him, their weapons flashing in a sun that belonged to a different century. Cannonballs whistled overhead, exploding in showers of dirt and flame that John could feel but that left no mark on the modern world around them. The smell of gunpowder and blood and fear filled the air, so thick he could taste it on his tongue. Colonel Arthur Devereux stood atop a small hill, still in his Union blue, watching a battle that had ended more than a century ago. Around him, ghostly soldiers moved through eternal combat, their forms flickering like old film, playing out the same movements they had made on that terrible July day. in 1863, some fell, their bodies jerking with impact, only to rise again and continue the charge. Others fired muskets that would never run out of ammunition at an enemy that could never truly die. "Another soul for the collection," Devereux said without turning, his voice carrying clearly over the sounds of battle. "Tell me, soldier, do you know what you've gotten yourself into?" John approached carefully, stepping over the ghostly wounded and dying, men who clutched at wounds that would never heal, who called for water that would never come. "I'm starting to understand." Devereux faced him then, and John saw that the colonel's chest bore a gaping wound from a Confederate saber, the edges still wet with blood that had been spilled over a century ago. His uniform was torn and stained, but his bearing remained proud and military, the posture of a man who had never learned to retreat. "The Vatican has been at this game for a very long time," Devereux said, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword. "Longer than you might imagine. They've been collecting souls since before America was even a dream in some Europeans' mind." "What game?" John asked, though he was beginning to suspect he already knew the answer. "Souls, Mr. Matthews. They collect souls, not through prayer or salvation, but through contracts, through men like you." Devereux's uniform began to fade, revealing pale, translucent flesh beneath. Men who are willing to do anything for money, who have nowhere else to go, nothing left to lose. Men who've already damned themselves with their choices. Around them, the battle raged on. The same charge repeated endlessly. The same men dying the same deaths over and over. John watched a young soldier take a bullet to the chest, fall, then stand up and charge again, only to be shot in exactly the same place by the same Confederate marksman, who would then reload and wait for the cycle to begin again. "Oh my God," John breathed, the scope of it hitting him like a physical blow. "How many of you are there?" "Thousands," Devereux said simply, gesturing to the battlefield around them. "Tens of thousands. Every war, every conflict, every moment of violence and desperation. The Vatican harvests what it needs." He looked down at his own wound, touching it gently, and his fingers came away bloody. "I thought I was fighting for the Union, for freedom, for the end of slavery. Turns out I was fighting for something much older and darker." The battlefield began to shift around them, showing John glimpses of other conflicts. Medieval crusades, Renaissance poisonings, modern assassinations, all connected, all part of the same vast network of violence and debt that stretched back centuries. "I can still leave," John said, though the words sounded hollow, even to him. "I can still walk away." "Can you?" Devereux smiled sadly, and John noticed that the colonel's teeth were stained with blood. "Look at your hands, soldier. Really look at them." John looked down and his heart stopped. His hands were translucent, like everything else in this place. He could see through his own flesh to the grass beneath, could see the ghostly battle raging through his body, like he was made of glass. But worse than that, he could see something moving under his skin, dark lines like veins, spreading from his fingertips towards his heart. "Welcome to the collection, soldier," Devereux said, saluting John with military precision. "Your service is just beginning." As the colonel faded away, dissolving into the eternal battle, John's phone buzzed again. Another payment notification, another target confirmed. But when he tried to call his bank, to check his balance, to confirm that any of this was real, his phone showed no signal, no connection to the world he'd left behind. The final address took him back to St. Mary's Cathedral, but not to the nave or confessionals. A door behind the altar, one he was certain hadn't been there before, now stood open like a mouth waiting to swallow him. Stone steps led down into darkness that seemed to pull at him, drawing him deeper into the earth with each step. The walls were carved with symbols that hurt to examine closely, depicting scenes of judgment and collection that spanned centuries. The chamber at the bottom was ancient, far older than the cathedral above, far older than the city itself. The walls were covered in frescoes that seemed to move when John wasn't looking directly at them, showing processions of figures carrying chains and contracts and souls that glowed like trapped stars. Pope Gregory XVII sat on a simple wooden throne in the center of it all, his medieval robes somehow both magnificent and terrible. Unlike the others, he seemed fully present, fully aware, fully alive in a way that was more terrifying than any ghost. "Welcome, my son," Gregory said in perfect English, though his lips didn't quite match the words he spoke. "You've done remarkably well, better than most we've recruited over the centuries." "What have I done?" John's voice echoed strangely in the chamber, seeming to come from everywhere at once. "You've gathered them," Gregory said, rising from his throne with fluid grace. "Each soul you've encountered was trapped between worlds, unable to move forward, unable to return. They needed assistance. They needed a collector to complete their contracts, to bind them properly to our service." Around the chamber's walls, John now saw them clearly for the first time. Dozens of figures in the shadows, men and women from different eras, all wearing the same haunted expression he was beginning to recognize in mirrors. All former collectors, all trapped in the same limbo between life and death, between service and freedom. "I wasn't killing them," John realized, the truth hitting him like ice water in his veins. "No, my clever boy, you were collecting them, drawing them into our service, making them part of our eternal workforce." Gregory's smile was paternal and terrifying, the expression of a kindly grandfather who collected butterflies by pinning them to boards while they were still alive. "Just as you yourself are being collected." The chamber around them began to expand, the walls stretching impossibly far, revealing more collectors, more souls trapped in service. John could see people from every era of history: Roman centurions, medieval knights, Renaissance assassins, modern soldiers, all of them carrying the same manila envelopes, all of them preparing for their next assignments. "This isn't possible," John said, though the words felt meaningless now. "People don't just disappear. People look for you. The police, the FBI." "Do they?" Gregory asked, genuinely curious. "Tell me, John, who will miss you? Your landlord who wants his rent? The restaurant owner who wants payment for your meals? Your neighbors who've never spoken to you? You chose this life of isolation, of anonymity. You made yourself perfect for our needs." The walls around them began to shift and change, showing scenes from John's life, his lonely apartment, his empty office, the jobs he'd taken that cut him off from normal human contact. Every choice he'd made, every bridge he'd burned, had led him here, to this moment, to this trap that had been decades in the making. "The Vatican has many needs," Gregory continued, beginning to pace around John's increasingly translucent form, like a predator circling wounded prey. "Souls to power our workings, agents to do our bidding in the modern world, collectors to bring in more. It's a system that has served us well for over 500 years, refined and perfected through centuries of practice." John tried to run, but his legs wouldn't obey. They were becoming translucent like his hands, fading into the same ghostly state as everyone else in the chamber. Panic clawed at his throat as he realized the truth. "Oh my God, the jobs I've done, the people I've killed, they were all for you." "Not directly, no. But every act of violence, every moment of desperation, every soul cut loose from the normal world, it all feeds back to us eventually. We simply help the process along." Gregory stopped directly in front of John, his ancient eyes boring into him with the weight of centuries. "Think about it, my son. Every target you eliminated was someone who preyed on the innocent. Every contract you fulfilled removed a predator from the world. You thought you were doing good work, didn't you?" The terrible thing was, John had thought exactly that. Each target had deserved what they got. The embezzler stealing from children's charities, the woman selling information to human traffickers, the corrupt judge letting rapists walk free. He told himself he was making the world a better place, one bullet at a time. "We've been guiding your career from the beginning," Gregory said, his voice taking on a hypnotic quality. "Every job, every target, every payment, all designed to isolate you further, to cut you off from human connection, to make you dependent on us. We needed someone with your particular skills, your particular lack of attachments. But the money was real, yes. We always pay our debts, honor our contracts, unlike some." Gregory's smile turned cold. "The question is, what will you do with that money now? How will you spend it from here?" Around the chamber, the other collectors stepped forward from the shadows, and John could see their stories written in their faces. A Roman soldier who'd murdered his commanding officer for gold. A medieval assassin who'd killed a bishop for silver. A Renaissance poisoner who'd eliminated rivals for political favour. Modern hitmen, ancient warriors, all bound by the same contract, all trapped in the same eternal service. "Don't despair, my son," Gregory said kindly, producing a manila envelope from the folds of his robes. "You'll have purpose here. In fact, I have your first assignment as one of our permanent staff." The envelope materialized in John's transparent hands, the paper feeling solid even as his fingers were becoming insubstantial. Inside, 5 new photographs, 5 new names, 5 new addresses. At the bottom, the same elegant script, 500,000 per name, 1 million bonus upon completion. "Your replacement is already being contacted," Gregory said, settling back onto his throne with satisfied ease. "A young woman in Chicago, computer specialist, some experience with problem-solving of the permanent variety, outstanding medical debts from her mother's cancer treatment, student loans that will take decades to pay off, a sick brother who needs experimental therapy she can't afford. She's perfect for our needs." John looked at the photographs with growing horror. 5 faces staring back at him, their eyes holding the same desperate hope he'd seen in Frank Bellamy, Richard Gray, Helen Carter, and Colonel Devereux. The hope that someone would finally set them free. But there was no freedom here, only the endless cycle of collection and service, of hunting and being hunted, of promises that were never quite what they seemed. "The beautiful thing about our system," Gregory said, his voice filled with genuine pride, "is that it's self-sustaining. Each collector brings in new souls, and eventually becomes bait for the next collector. We never run out of material, and we never run out of workers. The desperate and the damned reproduce themselves endlessly." John felt something inside him break, a final severing of whatever had connected him to the living world. The chamber around him came into sharp focus, and he could see it clearly now. The true scope of the Vatican's operation. Thousands of collectors from every era of history, each one carrying their assignments, each one hunting for the next generation of souls to add to the collection. "Welcome to the eternal service, Mr. Matthews," Gregory said, raising his hand in a blessing that felt more like a curse. "May your work honor the Lord and serve his mysterious purposes." The other collectors nodded their welcome, some smiling sadly, others maintaining the grim expressions of men who had accepted their fate long ago. John took his place among them, feeling the weight of his new existence settling on his shoulders like a lead cloak. Somewhere in Chicago, a secure phone was already buzzing, and another desperate soul was about to learn that some opportunities come with a price that can never be paid in full. But first, John had work to do. 5 more names to collect, 5 more souls to add to the Vatican's eternal workforce. He looked at the first photograph, a man in his 30s working late in an office, desperation written in the lines around his eyes. Someone with debts to pay, problems to solve, a willingness to do whatever it took to survive. Someone exactly like John had been. The hunt would begin again tomorrow, as it always did. John Matthews, former IT consultant, current collector of the damned, began to plan his first assignment in his new eternal career. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd spent his living years fixing problems for money, and now he'd spend his death creating problems for souls. The Vatican always gets what it wants, and what it wants is everything. In the darkness of the ancient chamber, as the cathedral bells began to toll midnight above them, John felt his transformation complete itself. His body was fully translucent now, existing in the space between life and death, bound by contracts written in languages older than Latin, sealed with blood and desperation, and the terrible mathematics of spiritual debt. Each chime of the bells was a reminder that time moves differently when you're caught between worlds, when your existence serves purposes older than countries, darker than any earthly sin. The first bell, acceptance. The second, understanding. The third, the beginning of forever. By the 12th chime, John Matthews, the living man, was gone entirely, replaced by something else. A tool, a weapon, a collector in service to powers that had been playing this game since before Christ walked the earth. The hunt would begin again tomorrow. It always did. And somewhere in the world another phone was ringing. Another desperate soul was about to answer, and the collection would continue as it had for centuries, as it would for centuries more. The Vatican's work was never done. There were always more debts to collect, more souls to gather, more servants to recruit into the eternal workforce of the damned. John opened his new assignment envelope and began to read. The first target lived in Seattle, worked in cybersecurity, had a gambling problem, and a daughter who needed surgery that he couldn't afford. Perfect material for recruitment. The collection continued, as it always had, as it always would. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Ghost. Amen.